Hey, August. Let's go through what I read in the month of August 2025. First up, I don't know how I'm going to talk about this in a short review. The Brothers Karamazov, or rather as this one's called, the Karamazov Brothers. This is the Ignat Avsi translation, and he's translated it as the Karamazov Brothers because that's how we would say it in English. However, every other translation I've seen calls it the Brothers Karamazov because the Russian is Bratya Karamazovi. So I tend to think of it as the Brothers Karamazov or the BK, which I first read when I was a student back in 1997, and I didn't enjoy it. I've since having just finished it, wondered whether I actually finished it back then or whether I read only enough to do a presentation in front of my class. This would have been in my honours year, junior honours at St Andrews University. And I had to give a presentation on the functions of Elder Zosima. Zosima is one of the main characters at the beginning of the novel, who is an elder or a starets. There's a kind of hiero monk. It's like a high up monk character. And he's the mentor of one of the brothers, Karamazov, Alyosha, who is also in the seminary. And I had to give a presentation on the elder Zosima's outlook on life. And given that it was near the beginning of the book, and also that I couldn't remember how it finished, although that doesn't mean I didn't finish it because my memory is dreadful. And it was 30 years ago, so, you know. This time, though, I absolutely loved it. I think it might be one of my favourite books, and it's definitely one that I will read again, I imagine, quite soon. It was picked by a Substack writer that I follow called Dana, who did an excellent Substack last year on Crime and Punishment. It was at the same time I was running mine. And she announced that this year she was going to do the Brothers Karamazov. However, she's disappeared. We were reading it quite slow up until April when she disappeared, and she was putting out amazing content. Amazing essays, rather. I'm going to try and get away from using the word content. That's going to be hard. Amazing essays going into the background of the characters and the locations and some of Dostoevsky's background. Fascinating stuff. So I don't know what happened to her. I miss her. Dana, if you're watching this, come back. I hope you're okay. That's the main thing. So yeah, the book, it follows the three Karamazov brothers, Alyosha, Dmitry and Ivan. And it was Dostoevsky's last novel. It came out in 1881. And it was intended to be part one of 2 or maybe even 3 novels. But he died, Dostoevsky, before he got to the next one. So let's just be grateful that he finished this. And it has a satisfying ending. It ends up being a kind of whodunit, not like Crime and Punishment, which is more of a why done it. So we've got the 3 brothers. 2 of them have the same mother, and the third one has a different mother. The father is a bit of a dick, to be honest. He's well-to-do. He's wealthy. He's kind of lifted himself up. A self-made man, you would probably call it these days. Miserly, arrogant, irreverent. In fact, there's a scene in it where they all go to the Stariets' cell in the monastery, and he makes a total arse of himself. It's a great scene, actually. It's quite comic in some ways, the way he's written. And he ends up being killed, so that's not a spoiler. That's kind of the crux of the book, really, and it becomes about who killed their father. Did any of the brothers do it, or was it somebody else? If so, why? There's all kinds of love interests going on between Dmitry and Ivan and the father. Dimitri's in love with the same girl that his father's in love with, and his father's trying to woo her with money. And so there's motive there for the murder to take place. And we don't find out until quite near the end, when there's a long trial, which is a great few chapters as well, the way that the trial is written. We've got the defence and we've got the prosecution and we've got the witnesses coming to the stand. It's gripping. It really is gripping. And if you haven't read Dostoevsky before and you're a bit afraid and you think it's going to be heavy and hard to read and challenging, it's not. It doesn't have to be. You can go deep into it if you want. You can follow up on all kinds of leads and go into philosophy and religion, and there's a lot of that in it, but you can just read through that without taking too much away from the plot. It doesn't detract from the plot, and it's eminently readable, especially in this translation. Eminently readable, and I highly recommend it. You know, if you haven't read Dostoevsky, maybe start with Crime and Punishment, because this is like almost 1,000 pages. Crime and Punishment's a little bit shorter, perhaps more accessible. I don't know. It's difficult. If I had to pick one, I would just not. But I think if you were asking what Dostoevsky you should read first, based on what I've read, and it's only these two, I would go with Crime and Punishment, I think, as your first. But definitely don't discount The Brothers Karamazov. So, at the time I was reading it with Dana, I was making regular updates on this channel, which you might have seen at the end of each part, but I kind of stopped that when Dana stopped, and I just wanted to read the book without worrying too much about making videos and all that stuff. So, you know, apologies if you were following along with that. I fell off it and just finished the book and had a great time. So there you go, Brothers Karamazov. Excellent book. Now, I have aspirations of writing historical fiction. I've got a few ideas. I enjoy reading historical fiction myself. So when I saw this book recommended on someone's Substack, someone whose name I have forgotten, I apologise for that. It sounded right up my street. This is by Andrea Barrett, winner of the National Book Award, Dust and Light on the Art of Fact in Fiction. It's a small book, in fact physically small as well. There's a normal size book. So, very small, and it was 15 quid, which I think was a little bit expensive for what it was. I enjoyed it. This is an author who writes historical fiction, and she's talking about how she does her research and what's important in historical fiction, in her opinion, and what's less important. And so I found it interesting, I found it helpful, and easy to read. It was an enjoyable read, very short. There was one chapter I didn't particularly enjoy because it basically goes into a whole story of hers. Chapter is Life Writing without a comma. I say that because there's another chapter called Life, Writing. And we get the whole short story pretty much. Chapter 6 it was. So I ended up skipping the story because it wasn't that interesting to me. But she then goes on to say why she told the whole story, and it goes on to say that the story really is true, or most of it is true, or it's mostly true, in quotation marks. Or at least the facts, those I chose to include, are true. Packard was born where and when I said he was educated as I said he was, held the jobs, wrote the books, made the trips I described. He did have an Aunt Sarah. His diary entries and the lines from the newspaper interview are real. He started a newsletter as a boy and later edited The American Naturalist. Blah, blah, blah. So then it goes on to say, but Henrietta Atkins, whose letter initiates the story, is invented, as is her friend Daphne. So the point is that a historical novel does not necessarily have to be a history book. In fact, it shouldn't be a history book. That's the one thing it should not be. And what's inspired me here, and the whole kind of genre as as a genre is having read Janet Fitch's books, beginning with The Revolution of Marina M, and then it's followed up by Chimes of a Lost Cathedral, which is set during the Russian Revolution, starts just before it. It follows a character who wasn't real, called Marina Makarovich. And she is a poet, and she lives through that period of time, and we follow her as a character. And that's what's going on here in this bit that I just read out to you. History provides the backdrop, but the characters live there and have to deal with it. And there are, in this Russian Revolution book, lots of real characters, and you get that in like War and Peace, for example. You've got Napoleon, and you've got the Tsar, all sorts of other, Kutuzov. So you bring real people in, but it's how the fictitious characters, fictional characters, is there a difference? How they relate to the real characters and to the time period and stuff. So in that regard, I found this to be a useful book. And I've got another quotation here I'd like to read out to you, which I found quite interesting. First of all, she says, "At the beginning of my career, I wrote in ignorance, from excitement and interest, and with passion, the most pleasant of all ways to write." So she's talking there about not becoming overwhelmed with research, getting bogged down in it all. Use your ignorance, just write from passion and excitement and interest. That's an interesting little quotation. And then she says here, page 49, that last one was page 153. This one, page 49. "Caught up in learning about the equivalent of grinders and eye teeth, I'd forgotten that while facts may be in a text, sometimes delectably, they can't be the entire text. Slowly I began to relearn something I'd once grasped, but had lost sight of that emotion. The central element of fiction derives not from information or explanation, nor from a logical arrangement of facts, but from powerful images and from the qualities of language, diction, rhythm, form, structure, association, metaphor. And sometimes I also had glimmers of another thing I'd once known, how effectively information can be used to wall off emotion, how the gathering of information can take the place of actual understanding. I had built, as it took me some time to realise, quite a substantial wall, as if any wall could block out those two towers." So, yeah, that's the message I'm taking away from the book, is if you're thinking about writing historical fiction, don't get bogged down in the minutiae of the facts, and don't allow it to smother your passion and excitement. That's what I take from it. Decent wee book, if a little overpriced. And what I will say is the paper stock, the print quality is excellent. That's something that is quite important to me. Going back to the Brothers Karamazov in this Oxford World Classics, I didn't like the quality of the print at all. It was a bit poor. So if that's important, you bear that in mind. So that's 2 of the 3 books I read in August. The third one, this was sent to me as a gift by a friend of mine who's also on Booktube, called Ray. Haruki Murakami, The City and Its Uncertain Walls. This one, yeah, I'm a big fan of Murakami. I've read, maybe 12 books of his. And I've been a fan since I read the first one, which was the wind-up Bird Chronicle back in 2010, something like that. I love his writing. I love the way the books make me feel. That's the primary thing. And this one here, it follows a main character who, at the beginning of the book, is 17. He's in love with a 16-year-old girl, and we follow their burgeoning, what's the word? Burgeoning. I think it's burgeoning relationship as a young teenaged couple, and then at one point she disappears, and he and she have created a world behind a wall, a town that's walled off. It's like a magical, mystical town where things are just slightly off kilter, things are different. And she says that if he wants to find the real version of her, she's in that town. And somehow he finds his way there by accident. And in order to get into the town, he has to give up his shadow. So his shadow gets ripped off before he enters the town. His eyes get damaged, and he ends up working in a library as a dream reader. And the girl works in the library, but she doesn't remember him from the outside because that version of her never met him. So he works with her in the dream library, and it goes on from there. I won't spoil any more plot. That's kind of the premise of it. And what I found about this was that the beginning 100 pages didn't grab me in the way that a Murakami book usually does. So I found myself kind of struggling a wee bit with it, but because it's Murakami, I was never going to quit. And after those 100 pages passed, it got into proper Murakami territory for me. I've read reviews that say the first 100 pages are the best bit of the book, so people's opinions differ. And in the afterword of the book, Murakami talks about how this was based on a novella that he'd written and not published when he was a younger man, like 30, 40 years ago. I can't remember exactly the timeline, but at the beginning of his career. And it was shelved, and then he came back to it during COVID and added other sections to it and created the novel that it now is, intertwining those early parts into newer parts. And so maybe the first part was written when he was young. I'm not sure which parts. He probably did say, but I can't remember. And as I say, as the 100 pages passed, it started getting into Murakami territory, where we follow the main character as he grows older, gives up his job, moves to a town in the mountains and gets a new job as head librarian in this new town. And he's not with the girlfriend because she disappeared when he was a kid. And he's basically had this girl in his mind for the whole of his life. And then he meets another character in this fictitious town in the mountains, a little boy who's neurodiverse. We're not told he's autistic or anything like that, but that's kind of my take on it. And he's known as M, or Yellow Submarine Boy, because he wears a parka with the yellow submarine on the front. And of course Murakami wouldn't be Murakami without bringing music into his story. There is some jazz as well, as you would expect. In the cafe, we hear jazz coming over the speakers in the cafe. But yeah, as I said at the beginning of this little excerpt, what I love about Murakami is the way that he makes me feel. And this one had that. When I got to the end of the book and I read the last line, it was like goosebumps. And in typical Murakami style, you're left like thinking, what was that about? It leaves you with questions, it doesn't give you answers, and it's the kind of book that you finish and then you're straight online saying, what did people think about that? What was that book about? And that's the kind of book I love, where you come away feeling like you've read something wonderful, but you're not sure what it means and why you love it. So yeah, I think I don't know how I would put it. It's about consciousness, I tend to think. It's about delving into one's creative space, the space that I try and find when I'm making these videos, or when I'm writing my pages in the morning, or what I hope to find when I'm writing a book, getting into that zone, that space where you're in the present. Do you know what I mean? You're not projecting fear, you're not dwelling on the past, you're just in storytelling mode, connected to something bigger. And I always come out of Murakami books feeling good, feeling like I've been somewhere and come back, and almost like I've reset, reconnected, and everything feels good and harmonious. That's what I get from Murakami books, and this one did not disappoint in that regard. And yeah, I did actually go back and listen to some more of it after having finished it, because there was a section I wanted to go back to, because I was writing about it on my Substack, and there's a scene in the book where the main character goes to the cafe where he meets a woman that runs the cafe, and they end up going on a couple of dates. And when they're having a discussion, he goes into the cafe to meet her, and she's reading a book, which is 100 Years of Cholera, or is it 1,000 Years of Cholera, by Gabriel Marquez. And they talk about the book, and he actually mentions magical realism, and this is a genre that's often assigned to Murakami's novels, magical realism, and he talks about it as being something that's not actually real. Let me just look it up for you, because I put a wee tab in quite happily. Love in the Time of Cholera, that's the book. So that she reads them out a passage from the book. And she says, in his stories, the real and the unreal, the living and the dead are all mixed together in one. Like that's an entirely ordinary, everyday thing. And then he replies, people often call that magical realism. True. But I think that although that way of telling stories might fit the critical criteria of magical realism, for Garcia Marquez himself, it's just ordinary realism. In the world he inhabits, the real and the unreal coexist, and he just describes those scenes the way he sees them. I sat down on the stool beside her and said, so you're saying that in the world he inhabits, the real and the unreal are equivalent, and that Garcia Marquez is simply recording that? Yes, I think that might be the case, and that's what I like about his novels. I'm like, so it's not Gabriel Marquez, it's Garcia Marquez. But, you know, talk about quoting yourself here. This is Murakami, I think, talking about the epithet that his novels get of magical realism, and he's saying it's not magical realism, it's just describing realism. I don't know, make of that what you will. So that was my August, a good month indeed for books. What have I got going on in September? Well, good question. First up, the book I showed you to give you the size of Dust and Light, The White Guard by Mikhail Bulgakov. This is a book that was assigned as a set text when I was a student back in St Andrews in first year, so it'd be 93, 94, and I never read it. So I'm going to put that right, and in order to make myself accountable, I'm going to do it in October with a group. So I've put that up on my Substack, and if you would like to join me in reading this book in October, then hit me up on Substack. It's a short book, and it's about a family in Ukraine during the civil war that follows the October Revolution in Russia. So it's all about the whites, who are the Tsarists, it's about the Ukrainian nationalists, and it's about the communists. So we've got three different factions, and we follow a family who are involved in that. This is a Russian copy that I have that was given to me as a gift when I was in Odessa. This is, let me show you the inscription. So it was from a pupil of mine when I was a teacher over there. She obviously loves Bulgakov, so I've had this on the shelf all that time. I will be referring to it just as I go. I won't be reading it in Russian. And I've got the original translation by Michael Glennie, which has been on my shelf since those student days. You can see, still an unread book. So I will be able to refer to two different translations as I go. But this translation by Roger Cockrell will be my primary reading copy. So I'm planning to read it in September in order to prepare for October. Another book that's been on my TBR for about the same length of time, The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This is the abridged edition. So the original is in 3 volumes. This condenses 3 volumes into one. And this is the 50th anniversary edition. And I'm already 150 pages in. Boy, oh boy, what an incredible book. This is my first Solzhenitsyn book. and I was given it as a present when I went to Odessa. A friend of mine gave me a copy of Volume 1 as I was heading out there, and I never read it. So I've had it on the shelf all that time, and it's interesting to me why I haven't read it, because it's right up my street. I've read quite a bit about the camps, about the famine, about Soviet history, but this is like the quintessential book about that, so it's odd that I've just never picked it up. I don't know why that is, but I'm glad to be addressing it now, and heartily enjoying it. So that's on the go right now. And another one I'm planning to read, which has been in my TBR for a couple of years, Villager by Tom Cox. I found Tom Cox on Substack, which is interesting because he's just left Substack. He's taken his newsletter over to his own URL and own platform. But when I discovered him, he posted a picture of old Ladybird books, and it grabbed me right away, just that feeling of nostalgia from having had those books as a kid. And I started reading his Substack and immediately bought his book, bought a paid subscription because I just love that guy's writing so much. In fact, I read a newsletter of his this morning as I sat out on the porch in the sun and the wind. And it was the first one I'd read since he quit Substack, and he goes into part of that, why he quit Substack, and it just really appeals to me, the whole idea of feeding the algorithm and serving the platforms and hoping to be discovered, and it takes, he calls it surface level work, whereas the deep level work is the writing, and he feels that it detracts from his writing if he's involving himself in all of this techno-capitalistic stuff, which is the word he used. So I found it fascinating, that essay. I'll put a link to it down below if you'd like to read that. But after I discovered him, this book had just come out, and it was published on Unbound, which is a publisher that ended up screwing him and a load of other authors because they went bust, and they'd already taken money from customers, including me, for the upcoming book that was coming out. It was a kind of crowdfunding publishing platform. So thankfully he's now moved, and his new book has just come out. I'm waiting on it to come. I've got it ordered through Blackwells. I'm getting a signed edition. I think it's called Everything Will Swallow You. So yeah, I figured before that I should probably read this one, because this was the first of his books I bought, having just discovered him. So I'm going to plan to read that in September as well. He's a very quirky writer, and I find him quite inspirational, actually. If I'm looking for books that make me feel like I want to write, then I think that's what I'm going to get from this. So I'm looking forward to it. And that's my September. So there you go, August and September wrapped. I'll see you again at the end of September, and we'll see how I got on. Hope you've had a good reading month yourselves. And yeah, I'll catch you at the end of the month. Bye for now.